Hello everyone. In the previous lectures, we have been exploring the different ways in which colonialism altered the traditional institutions in India. In this lecture, we will look at how colonial influence changed the terrain of traditional literature. One of the important genres that emerged during this time was the novel. Before the novels emerged, most literature in the traditional vein was based on myths and heroic stories from the past. And understanding literature also required special training. However, with the spread of Western education, this changed. Literature started reflecting real life experiences, and the language became more accessible to a wider audience. Among the new genres, the novel became particularly important. It allowed the newly emerging middle class to express their dreams, struggles, and values. The novel helped the English educated middle class imagine a modern identity by way of trying to balance tradition with colonial ideas of modernity and progress. It provided a way to reflect on the social changes happening at the time. However, it is important to note that these novels mainly focused on the lives of the upper caste and upper class people and often ignored the lives of lower caste, lower class individuals. Especially, this is true in the case of early novels. In this lecture, we will explore how the novel helped shape the moral and intellectual world of the colonial middle class. While I will mostly refer to early Malayalam novels like Indulekha, Vasumati, and Saraswati Vijayam, the themes and ideas in these novels are relevant to literature across many Indian languages during the colonial period. Some of the texts that you can refer to know more about these points that we discuss here include Realism and Reality, The Novel and Society in India by Meenakshi Mukherjee, G. Arunima's Writing Culture of Modernity and Malayalam Novels, Dilip Menon's Caste and Colonial Modernity, reading Saraswati Vijayam, and finally Meenati Pillai's Modernity and the Fetishizing of Female Chastity, C.V. Raman Pillai and the Anxiety of the Early Malayalam Novels. One of the most significant changes in Indian society brought about by British colonization is the shift in the country's literary landscape. Indian literature underwent ontological and thematic changes as a result of colonial education. Prior to colonialism, literary practitioners and theorists in the Sanskritic tradition, regardless of their geographical or temporal locations, agreed that literature was a unique form of expression that was very different from everyday speech. It was also widely believed that one could practice and appreciate literature only after receiving Kavi Shiksha or training in the art of composing and appreciating poetry. Similarly, in pre-modern Sanskrit literature, there was often an aura of the otherworldly in both the plot and the characters. This means that stories were not just grounded in ordinary everyday life, but often included elements that were magical, divine, or beyond human experience. Characters might be gods, sages with supernatural powers, talking animals, or heroic figures with extraordinary abilities. The events in the plot might involve curses, miracles, celestial interventions, or journeys across worlds, things that would not happen in real life. This sense of the otherworldly gave the literature a dreamlike or mythical quality, setting it apart from mundane reality and reinforcing the idea that literature was a higher, more imaginative mode of expression. The same was the situation even in the medieval period, when the writers had the option of composing their works in vernacular languages. Here, we should note that the vernacular language that was actually used during the medieval period was not the vernacular language or speech spoken by the common people. On the other hand, the vernacular literary language of the medieval period was the Sanskritized vernacular. This shows that a literary language was a unique form of linguistic expression, distinctly different from the ordinary form of speech. The literary Malayalam language of the medieval period is one specific example that I can bring up in front of you. The literary Malayalam of the medieval period was called the Manipravalam language. Manipravalam was a very hybrid language made up of Sanskrit and Kerala Bhasha. The text Lila Tilakam, which lists the grammatical rules underpinning the Manipravalam language, says that Manipravalam is a blending of Sanskrit and Kerala Bhasha. Bhasha Samskrita Yogo Manipravalam. Similar to Sanskrit poetics, which seeks to develop a translocal language for literary language, Lila Tilakam combined Sanskrit and Kerala Bhasha to produce a trans-regional literary language that was different from everyday speech. It is also important to remember that despite its apparent opposition to the monopoly of Sanskrit language in literature through the combination of Sanskrit and the vernacular language that is Malayalam, the Manipravalam literature of the medieval period also recreated the same mythical world like the literary world of earlier Sanskritic literature. Puranas, epics, and myths were frequently used as the source of literary works' content. This demonstrates two things. First, prior to the colonial era, the language used in literary expression was largely distinct from that of everyday speech. Secondly, the production and appreciation of literature always necessitated a special kind of training. The primary problem with this kind of a literary expression was that it catered only to the literary sensibilities of the elite sections of society. In other words, these literary works only got the appreciation of the educated elite well versed in Sanskrit literature. This does not mean that literary traditions in Malayalam never ever or did not imitate the style and cadence of everyday speech prior to the rise of literary expressions influenced by Western education. For example, Kilipattu and Thullal Prasthanam are two significant literary movements in Malayalam that merit particular attention in this regard. Thullal, an art form developed by the poet Kunjan Nambiar, is a humorous and satirical performance that combines dance, music, and storytelling. The performance highlights social issues and uses witty language to entertain and inform the audience. In Kerala's cultural history, Thullal is significant on two levels. In order to parody the social ills that are pervasive in society, Thullal established a new poetic tradition in pure Malayalam by separating itself from Sanskrit and Sanskritized Malayalam. Second, it introduced a very new performing art form outside of the elite coterie. Before Thullal, most art forms were performed in temples or courts and were meant mainly for the elite. But Thullal, with its lively dance, rhythmic storytelling, and simple language, was performed in public spaces and could be enjoyed by common people. It gave voice to everyday experiences and made fun of social problems in a way that everyone could understand and appreciate. This made it a truly popular and democratic art form. The same was true of the impact of Kilipattu on Malayalam literature. Like literary works in Sanskrit and Manipravalam, Kilipattu and Thullal Prasthanam were written in verse, but the verse was composed in the vernacular language. They made extensive use of the potential of Malayalam language as spoken by a common person. But very much like Sanskritic world, the characters and the storylines used in these works were lifted from Puranic and mythical sources, keeping them removed from historical reality and the experiences of society in which they were set. For example, Tunja Tezhuthachan's Adhyatma Ramayanam Kilipattu, which retells the Ramayana in Malayalam, was written in an approachable language, but the literary world present in Adhyatma Ramayanam was primarily from the Puranic world. The contemporary reality of the period was never explicitly portrayed in the work. The contemporary society found expression in these works only in an allegorical fashion. To put it differently, even though Thullal and Kilipattu allowed lay people to read the epic in their native tongue, the themes and characters were still very different from the reality they were used to. The characters were gods, kings, and heroes, and the stories were often set in mythical or distant worlds. So, even when common people could enjoy and understand and appreciate the text, their own real struggles, emotions, and social issues were not always represented directly. Instead, those issues appeared in symbolic or hidden ways through jokes, satire, or allegories rather than being openly discussed. Similarly, creating literature in the time of Thullal and Kilipattu also required special training. Even though these forms used the local language, the compositions were still in verse and followed specific poetic rules. To compose or deeply appreciate these works, one needed knowledge of grammar, prosody, and classical literature. So, despite their use of vernacular language, Thullal and Kilipattu were often created by trained scholars, and their performance or interpretation remained somewhat exclusive. The introduction of colonial education in India caused a shift in how people viewed and interacted with literature. Prose became a very significant writing style in Malayalam literature due in large part to English education. Thus, in India, a new definition of what was considered literary started to emerge by the late 19th century. The older, formal writing style that was prevalent in pre-colonial literature was then abandoned in favor of a new style that sought to sound more like everyday speech. In other words, newer literary sensibilities began to challenge the long-held belief that one must write literary works in a language that is very different from everyday speech. This shift contrasted with the classical literature of earlier centuries, which was primarily composed of mythological and Puranic characters and plots. Under the strong influence of the Western literary tradition and sensibilities, many Malayalam literary critics at the time harshly condemned Sanskrit's literary influence. They desired new methods for producing and evaluating literary works that were in line with the sentiments and language of daily life. C. Andapai's novel Nalu Peril Oruthan is a prime example in this respect. The author of this novel, Andapai, makes fun of the Sanskritic tendencies of creative writers in Kerala in the late 19th century who were fixated on using Sanskrit verses in place. The novel proposed that one should not write dramas in a language that was heavily Sanskritized in order to gain respect in society. A character in the novel, Achyuta Menon, who is thoroughly westernized, delivers a very lengthy speech near the novel's conclusion in this respect. He accuses Malayalam dramas of emulating ancient Sanskrit styles without contributing anything truly to literary culture. According to him, the conventional structure of Sanskrit play is no longer relevant. He opines that there is no need to employ the same technique today. In the speech, he expresses sorry for the conventional authors who continue to emulate the Sanskritic structure in vernacular dramas. This section of the novel demonstrates how Malayalam dramas of the era mindlessly adhere to outdated customs. Additionally, it criticized these plays for neglecting crucial components like character development and plot. When English education was introduced during the colonial rule, new forms of literary expression in vernacular Malayalam emerged in the 19th century. This led to the emergence of prose narratives, essays, autobiographies, the novel. It struck a chord with the expanding middle class intelligentsia. It was the most important of all these major trends in literature. I mean, the emergence of new genres. This signified a change in literary style from the classical Sanskritic tradition, which emphasized mythological themes and employed the social language to the representation of commonplace life in vernacular Malayalam. Western education was not the only factor that contributed to the rise of the novel. The development of the genre was heavily influenced by a number of factors, including the invention of the printing press, the expansion of the reading public, the growing need for books and libraries, and the rise of female readers, as foreseen by novelists such as Chandu Menon and others. The conditions that existed in India at this time were similar to those in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, which favored the growth of this new form of writing called the novel. Initially, the majority of Malayalam novels were either translations or copies of Western novels. Catherine Hannah Mullen's Pulmoni എന്നും കോരുണ എന്നും പേരായ രണ്ട് സ്ത്രീകളുടെ കഥ was one of the first books written in Malayalam. It was actually a translation of a book written in Bengali titled Fulmani or Koruner Bibaran. P.P. Ravindran, a literary critic in Malayalam, notes that contemporary Malayali readers who appreciate good literature would not find this book appealing. He claims that Pulmoni was written more as a means of dissemination of Christian religious ideas than as a true novel. He thinks it has more to do with Kerala's social history than its literary past. Padminiyum Korunayum, another translation of this book, was likewise a straightforward translation devoid of much creativity. Even the first printed Malayalam novel, Khadagavadham, by Reverend Richard Collins, although it discussed the life in Kerala in the 19th century, was just a translation of an English book titled The Slayer Slain. This demonstrates that the early Malayalam novels lacked a distinct literary voice and were primarily direct translations. But as time went on, things started to shift. By emphasizing more regional tales, characters, and themes, Malayalam novels gradually came to define themselves. Kerala culture was blended with Western forms in these new pieces. According to Dilip Menon, these novels became amphibious, that is, they combined elements of tradition and modernity. In the late 19th century, formal realism, which sought to represent a complete and truthful depiction of real life, influenced early Malayalam novels. The first major change that came with Western influence was the shift from the mythical world to a more realistic portrayal of life. This doesn't mean that traditional literary styles disappeared entirely. Rather, the new Western influence style emerged alongside the older forms, creating a literary space where both could exist and interact. Here, we should particularly need to note that the majority of these novels were written by newly educated middle class individuals who had exposure to Western education. For instance, O. Chandumenon, a lawyer from an upper caste, wrote Indulekha, the first significant Malayalam novel. He freely acknowledged that his writing was impacted by his Western education. In addition, he received training in Sanskrit drama and poetry. He served in the government before rising to the position of a sub-judge in Calicut. Another novelist, C. Andapai, who studied philosophy and became a Christian, was raised in a prosperous Christian household. He was a clerk in the education department and was well versed in Sanskrit. Despite coming from a lower caste background, Potheri Kunyambu, the author of the novel Saraswati Vijayam, was fluent in both English and Sanskrit. He was a lawyer too. The author of Premamridam, C.V. Ramampillai, came from an upper caste background. He studied Ayurveda and Sanskrit and was the son of a Sanskrit scholar. He attended Trivandrum's first English speaking school before earning his degree from Madras University. Puleli Kunju, another early novel, was written by Archdeacon Koshi, a senior priest from a very wealthy Christian family. He was also proficient in English, Latin, and Sanskrit. So, in summary, regardless of caste or class, all of these early novelists were from the upper classes of society. The ideals and passions of the well-educated middle class were represented in their writings. This distinguished 19th century literature from 18th century literature and signaled a significant shift in the subject matter and style of writing. The moral and intellectual values of the new middle class, which was attempting to adjust to the concepts of colonial modernity, were largely depicted in these early Malayalam novels. In order to achieve this, the authors frequently challenged more antiquated beliefs that ran counter to the contemporary viewpoints, such as traditional practices regarding marriage, inheritance, and property rights. In many Malayalam novels, this tension between the old and the new is evident. For instance, this conflict is portrayed in Chandu Menon's novel Indulekha through Indulekha's grandfather Panju Menon, who represents the older generation, and her uncle Kochu Krishna Menon, who is Western educated and represents the contemporary middle class. Panju Menon claims that because Indulekha is older than 15, she is eligible to get married. Krishna Menon disputes this, stating that she has not finished her education. He thinks it is more crucial that she receives a good education so that she can lead a very dignified and modern life. He claims that once she has received good education, she will be able to make intelligent marriage decisions on her own. പടിഞ്ഞാറെ കോവിലകത്ത് Ammaman Raja's novel Indumadi Swayamvaram similarly provides a comparable illustration. In this novel, the king's second wife, who upholds traditional values, berates the king for teaching Indumadi. She claims that girls who receive education become overtly independent and may enter into unwelcome relationships, which is why Indumadi fell in love with the hero Sukumaran. But the king, who is modern, outright rejects this particular proposition. So, a characteristic mark of the early novel is the clash between the old world order and the new one. Although many of these Malayalam novels showed scenes from colonial Kerala, they mostly focused on the lives of the elite, especially upper caste, upper class men. Writers like O. Chandumenon and Komatil Pandumenon, who belong to the Nayar caste, used their novels to suggest reforms in their own community. Their ideas were shaped by their Western education and the modern values. This early novel's emphasis on morality and reform was in fact elitist in her analysis of novels of Chandumenon's, Indulekha and V.T. Shangunni Menon's famous novel Padmavati. G. Arunima draws attention to this particular aspect. She contends that these books only depicted the internal struggles of Kerala's upper caste, English educated middle class rather than reflecting society at large. Arunima cautions the readers that these novels primarily focus on the issues of a select privileged group and should not be interpreted as complete depictions of Kerala society. For example, the main issue discussed in Chandu Menon's novel Indulekha is the Nayar practice of matriliny, where property is passed down through the mother's side. This system did not fit well with the Victorian morality or the moral values that many early novelists had adopted. As a result, some educated Nayar men began to see their own tradition as old-fashioned or wrong. The fact that Nayar women could have more than one husband especially made them uncomfortable. So, these novelists started to question their community's way of marriage and family. This focus on reform and moral values shows that these early novels were written from a very elitist point of view. Arunima also points this out in her study of novels like Indulekha and V.T. Shangunni Menon's famous work Padmavati. She argues that these novels mainly talk about the very personal struggles of Kerala's upper caste, English educated, middle class individuals. Arunima wants the readers not to treat these novels as full pictures of Kerala society because they mostly reflect the concerns of a small privileged group. Early Malayalam novels like Indulekha, Padmavati, Vasumati and Saraswati Vijayam mainly focused on the lives of Kerala's upper caste, English educated, middle class individuals. Arunima points out that the stories often ignored the experiences of the broader Malayali community and society, especially the lower caste society. She notes that about 3/4 of Malayali life is missing from these narratives, which predominantly highlight the lives of upper class Nayars. These novels frequently use the concept of family to critique the traditional matrilineal system and promote reforms favoring the affluent middle class. Arunima refers to them as caste scripts because they reflect deeper caste related issues rather than just family stories. In Indulekha and Vasumati, the main female characters are well educated in English and Sanskrit. While Indulekha represents the new Nayar women, Vasumati symbolizes a new type of Tiya woman. Despite being from a lower caste, Vasumati is portrayed similarly to Indulekha, suggesting that early middle class authors depicted lower caste characters in ways that aligned with their own beliefs and values. In Saraswati Vijayam, a Dalit man converts to Christianity and achieves success through Western education. However, the novel primarily focuses on a Brahmin character named Nambudiri who transforms from a violent landlord into a very humble scholar, rejecting caste distinctions. The novel's use of common Malayalam language marked a very significant shift, making literature more accessible to a broader audience. Despite these developments, most of these novels remained absolutely centered on Kerala's upper class, overlooking the struggles and daily lives of common people. They primarily addressed the middle class's efforts to balance modernity with tradition, reflecting the values of those aiming to align with colonial modernity. Having analyzed all the major points, let's now revise all the points that we have discussed so far. Novels brought about a major shift in the world of literature. Until their emergence, literary works were mostly shaped by myths and featured heroic figures from ancient stories. Creating and understanding literature often required specialized training. However, the spread of Western education changed this particular landscape significantly. Literature began to reflect real life experiences, and the language used became more familiar and accessible to a wider audience. Among the new genres that rose to prominence during this time, the novel stood out as particularly significant. The novel became an important medium through which the newly emerging middle class expressed their dreams, desires, struggles, and values. It offered a way for English educated middle class individuals to imagine a modern identity for themselves, one that attempted to balance tradition with the ideals of colonial modernity. The genre provided a space to reflect the tensions and transformations happening within society. However, it's very important to note that while these novels gave voice to the experiences of the upper caste and upper class sections, they often ignored the lives of the lower class, lower caste individuals, especially in their early years. This lecture explores how the novel, as a literary form, helped shape and express the moral and intellectual world of the colonial era middle class. Although my examples came primarily from early Malayalam novels such as Indulekha or Vasumati or Saraswati Vijayam, the ideas and patterns we saw in them are still relevant to literature produced across many Indian languages during the colonial period. I hope you have understood all the major lessons that we discussed in this lecture. If you have any doubts, please watch the video once again. You can also go through the transcripts attached along with this. Thank you.